Hello my friends and welcome back to my channel. In this video I like to talk about, I like to answer the question, how do you set up this HDR system level calibration menu, what a word, on the PlayStation 5, Xbox and Switch 2. And no, we're not going to talk about the PC. PC will be most likely a complete separate video. But how do you set up this menu in the correct way if you like to use HGiG, if you like to use dynamic tone mapping off, or if you like to use dynamic tone mapping on an LG OLED TV. And if you're new to my channel and you have no idea what I'm talking about, because HGiG dynamic tone mapping, what is this? Let's start with the basics. And for this video, I don't want to go into much details in regards to what is HGiG actually doing, what is dynamic tone mapping on or off doing. I like to keep it very simple. I like really to answer the question between what is the better way, HGiG versus dynamic tone mapping on, and how to set up dynamic tone mapping on if you like to use it on an LG OLED TV, okay? So again, if you're new to my channel, if you don't have any idea what I'm talking about, if you have an LG OLED TV, you most likely have also under advanced settings and brightness, you have an option called dynamic tone mapping. And if you're using the game mode in combination with a console or PC, you have also the option to change this between HGiG, dynamic tone mapping off and on. And this is what we're going to talk about in this video. What is the best way, first of all, for you in order, or for you to use in order to have the best HDR experience, and how to set up this menu. And again, it's the exact same thing for the Xbox or Switch 2, okay? I'm just using the PlayStation 5 today because I can. Okay, anyway, so today we're going to answer this question, HGiG versus dynamic tone mapping off, then versus dynamic tone mapping on, and how to set up this with the different tone mapping options. Okay, so let's start with HGiG. And what does HGiG actually stand for? It's HDR Gaming Interest Group. So there are a couple of companies like AMD, Nvidia, Microsoft, Sony, and many more. They're working together, they're supposed to work together to get you the best HDR experience with HGiG enabled. Okay, so what is HGiG doing on your TV? Basically nothing, and that's the trick. Basically really nothing. HGiG is not doing anything. It's just relying on the information what it gets from the console or PC. Very, very simple answer. Okay, so with HGiG enabled, there's no tone mapping happening on your TV. We can now go a little bit in more details what is exactly happening, but I don't want to do it, okay? That's a separate video, okay? So again, HGiG, no tone mapping option. Also very easy to explain. With HGiG enabled, you have the most accurate HDR experience on your TV or display. And before we now move on to dynamic tone mapping on versus off or on and off, let me explain one thing about HGiG, because I hear this so many times, or I read this so many times. HGiG supported games. There is no such thing like an HGiG supported game. And I will explain this to you when we're talking about the HDR system level calibration in more detail, okay? But again, there is not a single game supports HGiG natively. That's not a thing, okay? Forget about this. And now let's move on and let's talk about dynamic tone mapping on and off. And we learned already that with HGiG enabled on your display, there is no tone mapping happening at all. So with HGiG, the display is relying on the information from the console or PC. That's different with dynamic tone mapping on. There is a lot of tone mapping happening on the display. Dynamic tone mapping off, the same as HGiG, no tone mapping. And for this video, I would like to focus on dynamic tone mapping on versus HGiG, because in 99% of the time, dynamic tone mapping off is a very bad decision. At least that's my opinion. I know we have an option called professional on the newer LG OLED TVs. That's a complete separate video if you like to use this. But very quick explanation with the professional option. When we enabling dynamic tone mapping off, then we can actually make dynamic tone mapping off look very similar or even better than HGiG, okay? But again, I like to focus between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on, and what is actually the main difference. So you can already see that there is, in regards of average picture brightness, a huge difference, okay? And this is why many people actually prefer dynamic tone mapping on over HGiG. But what is exactly happening here? So right now, with dynamic tone mapping on, the content, what you send to the TV, gets analyzed all the time, okay? And the TV is tone mapping and deciding what to do the best to display this picture right now. And in this case, it decides to brighten up the whole picture because there's not much going on in regards to specular highlights. That's why the TV thinks, hey, let's just make it a little bit more vivid, popping. Let's just show what we can do with this display. Right the opposite when we have actually specular highlights like this here, okay? So, and I like to show you this now. When we're now switching between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on, you can actually see in regards of the average picture brightness, there is literally, or there's very almost no difference at all, okay? So, but, and this is hard for you to see, here with HGiG, everything is, yeah, in regards of clipping, there's no issues at all, okay? But when we use now dynamic tone mapping on, this actually gets a little bit more washed out, okay? So there's a little bit clipping happening at the moment. So because dynamic tone mapping on is trying to get you the best result, it's trying to adjust the picture to according to the information on the screen, okay? So right now, dynamic tone mapping on is actually struggling a little bit because it would like to show you a little bit more brightness, but it also knows, hey, here we have very bright specular highlights. I need to make sure actually we have a proper contrast between this and that. I can't, yeah, brighten up the picture like I would like to do it when we're talking about this here, okay? Because no specular highlight and dynamic tone mapping on can just use the whole power of the screen to brighten up the picture, okay? Again, here, not the case because dynamic tone mapping on recognize here, oh, we need to make sure that this is visible and we can't do as much as we would like to. And again, you can clearly see, I can clearly see this is actually blowing out as soon as I'm using dynamic tone mapping on. Why is that the case? That's how dynamic tone mapping on is working, okay? There's no way around. And even be setting up the HDR system level calibration menu in a different way or other way, you will always have blowing out or clipping details, okay? That's how it is with dynamic tone mapping on. That's why in regards of the most accurate HDR picture, there's no way around, yeah, in order, or you have to use HGiG in order to get the most accurate HDR experience. So let's just quickly come back to the question or to the HGiG supported games, because there is no such thing, okay? So all what we do with this HDR system level calibration menu, and the next take is how to do it actually, I will explain this, but what we're doing here is we're telling basically the console or the PC what is our display capable of, okay, in regards of peak brightness and stuff like that. So that means if you don't have HGiG, you still have to set this up, because otherwise your console doesn't know what to do. Because if you leave this at the absolute lowest level, this is what the console will work with, or your PC. That's bad, okay? So again, just because your display supports HGiG, this has nothing to do with the console or the game. HGiG is purely a functionality of the TV or display to get the best possible HDR effect or HDR picture, because HGiG will do one thing. It will cut exactly at the peak brightness of your display. That means you end up with 1500 nits here in terms of the settings on the LG G4. For the G5, I think it was 2200 nits, okay? So that means this will exactly cut with HGiG enabled at 2200 nits. And if you press next, your console now knows, or here, PlayStation, where is it? Here. PlayStation now knows, hey, this display, and I have no idea what display is actually connected, but it doesn't matter. I know my user, which I love, has set up this menu to 2200 nits or 1500 nits for the LG G4. Again, a game does not need to support anything like that. And even more, Some games, most of the games, are actually not even supporting this menu. Most of the games having in-game sliders, okay? So now you can also use those in-game sliders either with HGiG enabled on your TV or display, or you use it with dynamic tone mapping on. It's exactly the same. It doesn't matter if you set up this menu with 1500 nits with HGiG enabled, or you use in-game sliders and set this up to 1500 nits with HGiG enabled. No difference at all, okay? So again, not a single game out there supports HGiG. HGiG is purely a function on your TV to make sure HDR, what is coming from the console, is displayed in the most accurate way. And now let's talk about the HDR system level calibration, in this case on the PlayStation 5, but it's exactly the same on the Switch 2 and also the Xbox, okay? So I'm just using the PlayStation 5 because, because I can. Anyway, so how do you set up this menu in the correct way? And if you have HGiG enabled, which I have at the moment, this is absolutely straightforward. So this is actually my recommendation anyway. If you have an LG G4, 5 or whatever, very bright TVs, give it a try. Just go to picture settings and make sure, this is the game optimizer menu by the way, that HGiG is enabled, okay? HGiG is enabled, and all what you need to do is then you just follow the instruction on the screen. Not quite, okay? But anyway, make sure this is barely visible, like here. I hope you can actually see this right now. This is barely visible, and then you do one tick more, okay? Very important. Go ahead, one tick more, that you can't see the sun anymore. The same counts for this next menu here. You increase this until it's barely visible, and then one tick more. Barely visible at the moment, and now one tick more. The next step, very important, I always recommend go to the absolute minimum, okay? Absolute minimum. You don't want to see any, this needs to be grayed out, okay? And then all what you have to do is press OK. That's the correct setting for HGiG. But what about if you like to use now this with dynamic tone mapping on? Because I'm going to show you something. If you now change to dynamic tone mapping on, and keep in mind, we set up this in the correct way for HGiG, but if we're now using dynamic tone mapping on, right, can you see what's happening? You can see now this one. So now the big question is this now correct, or should we now increase this until we can't see it anymore? And this is the main question I like to answer in this video. And the first thing what I like to share with you, I have recorded the HDR signal 3 times in the game Ratchet & Clank on my PlayStation 5. The first recording was with 1500 nits. So I have set up my LG G4 with HGiG, started the game, and I recorded the result actually. So the next recording was with 4000 nits. 4000 nits is what dynamic tone mapping on and off is expecting as a signal. And last but not least, I recorded Ratchet & Clank with 10,000 nits, the absolute maximum setting what you can do for the Xbox, PlayStation 5 and Switch 2. And the reason why I choose Ratchet & Clank is because, in my opinion, this is still a masterpiece when we're talking about HDR implementation, and also when we're talking about contrast dynamic range and stuff like that. It's just perfect in my opinion. We have no issues with the HDR black level floor, and we have no issues with specular highlights. And also what we can see, of course, is that in regards of the specular highlights, we have differences now, because one time we have 1500 nits maximum peak brightness, the other time is roughly around 4000 nits, and then we have roughly around 10,000 nits. What is more important is actually when we're looking now at the midtones, because here we can actually see a very big difference between 1500, 4000 and 10,000 nits calibration. When we're looking at the midtones around 200, 400 nits, then you can see the higher our maximum peak brightness calibration is, that means 1500 nits the lowest, 10,000 nits the highest, the more midtones, or the brighter the midtones are actually getting. So it's not just about specular highlights. We're also stretching the midtones more. That means the average picture brightness is getting higher. And before we're now moving on to the next chapter, which will answer the question how you should calibrate, or what maximum peak brightness setting should you use if you like to use dynamic tone mapping on an LG OLED TV like the G4, let's do a quick summary. So first of all, what did we learn? We learned there's no such thing as HGiG supported games, okay? Full stop, there's no such thing. HGiG is purely a functionality on your screen to make sure, in combination with the correct setting in your game, either through the HDR system level calibration or with in-game settings, you will have, with HGiG enabled, the most accurate way to display the HDR signal, okay? If you like it, that's a different topic. What we also learned is dynamic tone mapping on will give you most of the time, a much higher average picture brightness. I showed you this, but the downside is you have a lot of clipping and specular highlights, okay? Dynamic tone mapping off, most of the time, a very bad decision because it will just not give you a proper HDR experience. Because what we would need to have, and correct me if I'm wrong, but because the LG OLED TV is with dynamic tone mapping off and on, is expecting a 4000 nits signal. First of all, of course, we can set this up, but the next thing is our TV can't do 4000 nits. So it's not possible, okay? I would actually say that but that's just me thinking, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but if we have a TV display with a 4000 nits brightness, or the TV can do 4000 nits, there shouldn't be any difference between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping off if the TV supports exactly 4000 nits. There shouldn't be anything because it should be exactly the same. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, most of the time, because your display can't do 4000 nits, it's a very bad decision, okay? So what else did we learn? I think that's now, we learned also that the higher we're going with the maximum peak brightness setting on the PlayStation 5, and I will confirm this with the Xbox. I'm pretty sure it's exactly the same on the Xbox, but I will confirm this on the Switch too. The higher we go, it's not just about specular highlights, it's also about mid-tones. And now you maybe understand why we need to have brighter displays in general, not just to have higher peak brightness, which is also good, but also to have a higher average picture brightness, mid-tones, okay? Because as soon as we can calibrate, or we can use a higher maximum peak brightness on your display, we will also have a higher average picture brightness, okay? So that's for the quick summary. And now let's move on and let's answer the question, how should you calibrate, or what maximum peak brightness setting should you use? Is it 4000 nits? Is it 5000? Is it 10,000 nits? If you like to use dynamic tone mapping on an LG OLED TV like the G4. And the first recording what I have prepared for you, what I like to show you, is HGiG 1500 nits calibrated with the PlayStation 5 calibration menu. And then I switched on dynamic tone mapping on. That's the recording right now. And you can see there is, in regards of the average picture brightness, and we talked about this already, there is a clear advantage for dynamic tone mapping on. But there's also, and we also talked about this already, there's a very big disadvantage when it comes to specular highlights, when it comes to details in specular highlights. And here a couple of samples actually where you can see why HGiG is the way to go when it comes to accuracy, when it comes to the most accurate HDR experience. And the next recording what I have prepared for you is again HGiG 1500 nits to match my LG G4, but this time dynamic tone mapping on is calibrated with 4000 nits. That's the value what the LG OLED TV is expecting actually when you use dynamic tone mapping on or off. And when we're now comparing HGiG with dynamic tone mapping on, you can see that there is again an advantage in regards to the average picture brightness for dynamic tone mapping on. But there's also, like before, a disadvantage when it comes to specular highlights, because there's literally no way that dynamic tone mapping on can show you this in a proper way. The best way in regards to specular highlights is HGiG. But now, this next recording is very interesting and very important for this video. Now I'm showing dynamic tone mapping on, calibrated with 1500 nits and calibrated with 4000 nits. And here, when we're looking very, very closely, we can actually see that the 1500 nits calibration shows slightly more shadow details, but on the other hand, it has also more trouble to show specular highlights. So in general, I would say when you use dynamic tone mapping on with 1500 nits, so that means actually you calibrate your HGiG4 with HGiG enabled, that means you end up with 1500 nits, and then you turn on dynamic tone mapping on, you end up with a slightly washed out picture compared to dynamic tone mapping on calibrated with 4000 nits. And I fully understand that watching this on YouTube, watching this on a smaller screen, it is very hard to see the difference. And the difference is not like a day and night difference. There are subtle differences, but I can see them. Again, if you use dynamic tone mapping on, in my case on the HGiG4, and I'm calibrating or I'm using 4000 nits as maximum peak brightness, the picture has a better contrast compared to dynamic tone mapping on and using 1500 nits to match the HGiG4. So in this case, there's a very clear winner. Dynamic tone mapping on should be used with 4000 nits maximum peak brightness. And last but not least, I have also compared HGiG 1500 nits calibration with dynamic tone mapping off 4000 nits calibration and also 10,000 nits calibration. But believe me, again, in a game like Ratchet & Clank, it's just a bad decision because first of all, in regards of the average picture brightness, there's literally no difference between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping off. In regards of the specular highlights, there's also no difference in regards to dynamic tone mapping off and dynamic tone mapping on because both modes actually showing clipping. The only way to have no clipping in specular highlights if you use HGiG with a proper set up maximum peak brightness. So again, dynamic tone mapping off in most of the cases, the worst idea. Stick either to HGiG or dynamic tone mapping on. Okay, my friends, and here we have the answer now. If you like to use dynamic tone mapping on the LG OLED TVs, use 4000 nits maximum peak brightness. You can either do this with setting up, you turn on dynamic tone mapping on, and you just increase this, and I know my camera can't capture this anymore, but now it's barely visible. You do one tick more and it's 4000 nits, okay? It's very, very accurate, okay? Same with the second page. You increase this until you barely can't see it, and you do one tick more. Here again, go to the absolute minimum, okay? Make sure this one here is grayed out, okay? And then you're good to go. If you like to use HGiG, we talked about this, turn on HGiG and do the exact same thing, okay? So the difference is between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on. Main difference is, first of all, HGiG, much better specular highlights in regards of no clipping. You have all the details. It's not washed out and stuff like that. It's just better, okay, in regards of the HDR presentation. But you may end up with a lower average picture brightness. That's why you like, or maybe you like to use dynamic tone mapping on. But again, in regards of setting up this menu, there's literally no difference between HGiG and dynamic tone mapping on, because all what you do is you increase this until you can't see the sun anymore. The same counts for the Xbox Series and also for the Switch 2. Okay, so very simple answer. 4000 nits is the way to go on LG OLED TVs. On LG OLED TVs, because we have different TVs out there, different tone mapping options. So maybe it's not the correct way for those TVs. But again, I proved it. If you like to have the best experience in regards of the HDR presentation with dynamic tone mapping on, use 4000 nits here and in-game settings as well. And I think that's for that video. Let me know in the comment section if there's anything wrong with this video. Let me know in the comment section if you tried it actually on different TVs or displays and what was your outcome, because I really like to know that. And yeah, let me know if you like this video, so maybe leave me a like, a comment, and if you're new to my channel, subscribe. Thank you very much, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.